I'm a doctor, a father, an American, an Indian. I've had conversations about life from every angle, and as I've navigated the South Asian experience, I share stories of people and their purpose. And what they're saying over and over again is, trust me, I know what I'm doing. I'm Abhay, and on this episode of Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing, I'm joined by M R Rangaswami, the community building and philanthropic founder of the global nonprofit INDIASPORA. Stay tuned. Hey, so a truly genuine thank you for listening to the show, for sharing it with your friends, for downloading, subscribing, and rating the podcast, and for following us on social media at Dr. Abhay. It means a lot that Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing has a home in your menu of choices, and I thank you for that. It feels really good to have a sense of belonging, right? We all crave it, and it's certainly not without its challenges. Finding your place in a global, evolving, and diversely connected community like the worldwide Indian diaspora is no small feat. It's a delicate set of orchestrated balances too, how to find your individuality while making contributions to an ecosystem of people, how to maintain a lens on India while also attending to your own community, and how to evolve and define ourselves as a minority through levers of power, giving, and influence. Thankfully, M R Rangaswami has been thinking about and advancing the answer to many of these questions. He's an entrepreneur, investor, community builder, and philanthropist. MR immigrated to the US and found his way to Silicon Valley as a software business expert. And since then, he helped co-found the Sandhill Group, one of the earliest angel investing firms. And then he founded the Corporate Eco Forum as a vehicle for environmental consciousness and committed action. So with this backdrop and a deep commitment to the global Indian community, in 2012, MR founded INDIASPORA as a nonprofit organization committed to inspiring the global Indian diaspora to be a force for good. He's been a wonderful champion of building networks and truly nurturing philanthropy, service, and influence. A culture of giving and catalyzing social change is at the core of his effort. And as MR and I chatted, I asked him how he thinks the diaspora has changed in the past 10 years, especially given his unique front row seat perspective.
Yeah, I think we've come a long way, Abhay. You know, the diaspora is about 32 million in size across the globe. And there are probably 5 big epicenters, if you will: the US, Canada, UK, Singapore, and the UAE. Now, each one of the migrations to these countries have happened very differently. And some were during pre-colonial, some were colonial, and some more recent. But I think it's taken the diaspora a little bit of time in terms of like reaching its stature, being more visible, gaining more reputation and credibility. I think that's all come about in the past maybe 10, 20 years. You know, when INDIASPORA started in 2012, I mean, most Indians in the US used to thump our chests and say, hey, we're the highest earning.
Right. Look at us. Yeah,
it's us. We're highest earning demographic. We're the highest educated people. We are this. We are the 7% of the doctors. We're 10% of the IT workforce. Rah, 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 right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we did. But what we didn't have really at that time was the influence that we have today. And that was because we were just maturing as a community. And even though we're 1% of the population, we really didn't have much say in what was going on in the US.
So, you know, in these, say, 10 years since INDIASPORA was founded, what's maybe accelerated that maturation process beyond just the sort of, you know, chest thumping or waving of the model minority sort of business, particularly here in the US, but has there been something that's really kind of driven or fueled that maturation?
Yeah, I think when we first met in 2012, one of the things we looked around the room, we had 100 leaders across the community, tech CEOs, entrepreneurs, doctors, lawyers, academics, all gathered in upstate New York, which hopefully is a place called Mohonk, which might become famous 20 years from now to say, hey, that's where the Indians gathered.
It is the global Indian Woodstock, if you will.
Yeah,
right?
You got it. And everybody's going to claim they were there.
That's right.
So when we looked around the room and we did all the chest thumping, and then someone said, you know, we're 1% of the population. Do we have any representation in Congress?
Yeah.
And it was like, we had nobody, right? So one of the first things we set about as an aspiration was let us become 1% of Congress. And what that meant was, you do the numbers, we got to get 5 people into Congress, right?
Yeah.
So INDIASPORA as a nonprofit couldn't do that. We couldn't endorse or contribute money to political campaigns. But as a network, we agreed as individuals that we would write checks to anybody with an Indian name. Yes. So along came Khanna, Krishnamurthy, Jayapal, Kamala, Ami, and all these folks. And we wrote checks to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yes, hundreds of thousands of dollars to anybody with an Indian name.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, we didn't realize this. In 3 election cycles, we then had the INDIASPORA Gala in DC to celebrate and be recognized that Indians were now 1% of Congress. That fueled the initial influence. And when that happened and Nancy Pelosi showed up at our gala and all this stuff, it just set off this storm of people looking at us as political folks, that we can write checks and we can also get people elected. I think that was kind of the initial milestone, if you will.
Sure. And I think you and I have even talked about this, but the diaspora is so much more than representing 1% of Congress or the professions that you mentioned, but that it goes to, virtually now pervading every single aspect of society, in particularly these geographic regions across the globe that you mentioned, and here in the US for sure. With how we're all so well connected, and in thinking about that, is there more of an appetite for now global linkages from these people back to India? Or is it more of an inclination towards affirming many, many micro identities here in the States and abroad?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. There are 2 generations of diaspora. People like me, who grew up in India, came over here to study or to get a job, whatever. We bring a certain perspective. And there are other people who are born and raised in the US. So I think you got to divide up the diaspora. I think today in the US, it's roughly 2/3 people like me who came over and 1/3 who are born and raised.
People like me. Yeah.
Like you, right? Yeah. So that's the difference. So I think you look at the perspective of the older generation, if you will, they want very strong ties to India. Yeah. That's where we came from. And so there's that connect. I think the younger generation has its own aspirations, its own goals, own way of networking and stuff. And I think they'd be a little bit more curious about, hey, how did people like me grow up in the UK or in Singapore or UAE? How do I connect? What are our global aspirations? How are we different than our parents who grew up a different way, right? So I think what INDIASPORA is hearing from our membership and the community is do both. So INDIASPORA will be opening up an office in India as we speak, so that we can connect the diaspora with the homeland. But we're also getting tremendous amount of interest, like I said, from the other diasporas around the world. So we'll be doing both over the next 5 years and providing a network. And this is not merely a network, Abhay. It's also a network to be a force for good. Yeah. And like I said earlier, we're the highest earning demographic. That's just one part of the story. I think we need to be known as the highest givers in society, not the highest earners. And that's part of INDIASPORA's ethos, is to help everyone, connect everyone, and give back.
This ethos of connecting, and you're someone who's really, really been a force for great change and a lot of catalyst-like behavior in connecting people, making bridges and collaborating. I'm so curious about one thing. Can a Silicon Valley Indian American feasibly build relationships with the Indian American cab driver in Mississippi or the motel owner in Michigan, who may or may not have the same kind of backdrop or background as the people who are in that upstate New York launching pad?
I thought the same as well in the beginning, but having met thousands and thousands of people in the diaspora in the US, there is some connection with where you came from, which kind of bonds people together. And I found that over and over again. You meet someone who is an Uber driver in New York, and you suddenly start talking about cricket or Bollywood or something. And, you find that common linkage. And so what we have found is that INDIASPORA is a membership group. So we have a group of people who contribute to the organization, but then we support the greater community. And the greater community consists of people from so many professions, like you said, from doctors, lawyers, academics, to IT workers, to hotel workers to and beyond. And there's a common bond. There's so many things that really join us.
I'd say pani puri is probably
and pani puri and dosas, right? I mean, there's so much things that draw us together, and the curiosity. You meet some other Indian. I think it's innate in our DNA to be curious. Where's Abhay from? Where's his parents from? What does he do? Right. That's part of our culture, is to always find out what others are doing. Right.
It's so amazing that curiosity, especially in developing conversation, is one that, yes, is roiled into the DNA, but hopefully through networks like this, or from even just casual conversation that people have. One of the things that I've always talked about on this show is that conversation is a sort of antidote to apathy. And hopefully that's an easy one to think about, and hopefully helping to motivate people. When you think about what motivates members of the Indian diaspora to catalyze change, is, especially important ones like Black Lives Matter or Stop Asian Hate, that on the surface may not be perceived to be directly linked to the individual global Indian. How do you develop that motivation? How do you sort of fuel that motivation for that kind of catalytic change?
I think earlier, Abhay had mentioned, were we the model minority and stuff? Yes, we were. But I think over time, we were getting more vocal. But I'll tell you this, when BLM happened and there was all these hate crimes against Asians, I think the untold story was there were a lot of such crimes against Indians. We never spoke up. We never went public with that. And in talking to people across, one of my friends, this is right here in California, you'd think very liberal, very receptive to foreigners and stuff. During 3-4 years ago, one of my friend's daughters, who was born and raised like you in the US, was standing in line at a Starbucks. And she was told by a lady behind her to go home. And she was perplexed. She's like, I was born and raised here. These incidents never come out. Whereas if this was against a Jewish person, the Anti-Defamation League would be there at that restaurant, getting an apology from the manager. It would be and that's what we need to learn from other communities like the Jewish community or the African American community or the Asian, to stand up for our rights. And I don't think we've done enough. And that's why when BLM happened, we came out in strong support, because there was such a feeling within our community. This has happened to us. We never spoke up.
And is it really the relatability to that? Do you ever find that there are people even within our own community who have resistance to, in some ways, kind of standing up for those other communities?
Absolutely. I think it's happened. It's a subliminal thing. I think when it happens to us, that's when we realize, hey, it can happen to all of us who are brown or black. It's not something that's particular to one sub-community.
Your own journey took you through many of these kinds of lessons, and it took you from software to angel investing to an expertise in corporate environmental consciousness, and then, of course, to INDIASPORA, and many of those other journeys are continuing. As you reflect on this now, is there a common thread that's linking all of those together, linking those milestones? Is there sort of a North Star or even a architecture to your personal mission and vision that has bound all of these things together?
Yeah, Abhay, that's a billion-dollar question that I'm trying to myself answer, and it's not an easy one. This is something I'm trying to discover, like, why do I do this? And what is my purpose in life as well? More recently, I've started attending Bhagavad Gita classes just to understand who I am and why I'm here and so forth. And the best way to date I can describe this is I am just doing good for the community, good for people. I really don't yet understand why I'm doing it. So far, all I know is my mission is to help people. But that's really the one common thread I find with my CEO group of software and tech CEOs, where we bring them together, but we donate all the profits to charity, or my corporate eco forum, where we bring together 70 of the world's largest companies to mitigate climate change, or INDIASPORA to be a force for good. The common theme is help each other, network, do things that are good, But I still don't know why I exist. And maybe one of these days I'll come back to you and we can have a separate discussion on purpose and journey in life and so forth.
Even when you were first starting, like when your first maybe foray into Silicon Valley after you had immigrated here, was there even in those days that kind of feeling for giving, for being part of a community, that there was something bigger than just you?
Yeah, I think this might have come about when I first came to the country. You know, I was traveling from upstate New York to go to college in Ohio, and my sister-in-law had packed a brand new box of pots and pans she had gotten for me and all the Indian masala and spices. And I took the Greyhound bus to go to college. And when I ended up there, someone had stolen the box, you know, and I was, kind of perplexed and disappointed. But my host family in college, when they heard about this, the first thing they did, they went to the Kmart locally, bought me pots and pans. Of course, they couldn't get the spices, but the warmth of the community when you were in need, I think stood out to me even today, how welcoming America was, how good the people are here. You know, you might hear of stories of the other side, but I have felt nothing in the sense of when you're in need, people here just go out to help you. That triggered me later to do something, give something back. I think that's the only thing I can think of now is why am I doing it? Because someone helped me in the past.
And I wonder if it's sort of this kind of reflecting the gratitude that you have and sharing that in so many ways. You've been so incredibly successful at building networks and galvanizing philanthropy through yourself and through others. This must, as you say, bring some great joy and some great gratification. What has it actually brought for you to learn about yourself, but particularly from the giving side? You mentioned that, you felt so great receiving that show of love from your host family. When you give, is there an equally a sense of gratitude? And how have you been able to sort of let that grow and develop and continue to learn from that?
What I found out, Abhay, is actually giving, you have more gratification than receiving. When I started my first event for CEOs, it was a network and everybody, had to pay $6,000 to show up. And I didn't have any differentiation for my network or conference. And that's when I started thinking, how can I be different? That's when I changed the model of my event to be one where all the profits go to nonprofits.
Yeah.
That one single change was hard to do because I was looking at this pile of money I would make if I did this event. And when I flipped the model, I felt so much better. And all the attendees felt so much better to write checks. That moment was the time when I think I became a philanthropist. It was not something that I planned on and not something I waited for that moment. It just happened as a matter of business. And when that flipped my switch, I felt so much better at the end of that first year. I remember we collected something like $200,000 of profit and we had to give it away. And it was such a good feeling to choose different nonprofits and hand them checks, for them to go do work. It was so much better than to make $1 million. I can tell you that much.
Was that a surprise to the other people who were there as well? I mean, that they felt like, wow, I didn't realize that this could happen this way.
Absolutely. Because, when someone asks you to write a check for a for-profit event, you kind of then start looking at what am I getting? What are my benefits? It becomes transactional. When you go and say, hey, you know what? We're all going to write checks and we're all going to collectively give the money away. Very different conversation. And we've had CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, the big tech companies, all write us checks for the privilege of keynoting our event, which is never heard of in the industry. They keep this in their mind. When they meet me later on, they say, you're the only event that I paid to attend.
Yeah. How infectious does that become then? Is the hope and expectation that this spawns off many other similar kinds of groups and events and that they're kind of gelled and coagulated together by the spirit of giving or seva?
Yeah, and that's evolved, Abhay, because with that same CEO network, initially we just gave checks. Yeah. Then we started bringing these nonprofits to attend our retreat for 2.5 days to learn from these successful business leaders how they can scale, how they can raise more money, how they can get a mentor, an advisor, a board member, and even more money from the companies that these folks represent. So now this network has evolved to one not of just giving a check, but helping these nonprofits scale, grow, and become more successful. So again, it's an evolution that's happened that's helpful to all the attendees because they didn't merely write a check. They now join the board of a nonprofit, or they, became an advisor or a mentor to this young CEO of a nonprofit. So much more gratifying than writing a check.
With how integrated we've all become into so many aspects of society, like we were talking about, how do you then maybe galvanize this for the folks who are not CEOs, who are, middle-class Americans or folks who may be even struggling, and can giving and can networking, can it still pervade into those lives in order to develop that same kind of spirit and that same kind of joy? Have you found success in that element as well?
Yeah, let me give an example of a Chalo Give, Let's Give campaign that INDIASPORA initiated a few years ago, where we said, there are these very wealthy Indians who can give directly to nonprofits. They have their own foundations. But what about the other 3.9 million of us who are Indian Americans who don't have that ability, but are willing to give $5, $10, $20, $50, $100 to nonprofits? So Chalo Give is an online campaign that we initiated a few years ago, been very successful, where we got people in the greater community to go to the Chalo Give website, find an organization or a cause, just press a button. It's like Amazon's one-click buying. You do kind of literally a one-click donation to a charity of your choice. And during COVID, the community just rose up like we've never seen before. Between the two waves of COVID, Abhay, we raised over $5 million through Chalo Give. Wow. This is a big amount of money, but then through our partners and collaborations with other organizations, raised another 10 million. Overall, in 2 years, we've raised $15 million for COVID relief, both in the US and in India. And this all was done online.
Do you find that we do have to keep our eye on priorities that are happening both here and in India at the same time? Because committing to seva, committing to leadership, committing to engagement and inspiration and even political action requires a menu that faces the community whose attention is, as we talked about, straddling both the Indian and American currents. So is there almost an art to how to steer appropriately and how to prioritize for folks who are now already in the spirit of giving and inspiring, but perhaps are torn by, wow, do I pay attention to the political climate here, or do I give to my brethren back in India?
So I think this is something we deal with. And so it's not either or, it's an and. Yeah. The way we look at it is Chalo Give has two components to it. One is what we call give where you live. Yeah. So you and I live in the Bay Area. We need to give back to our communities where we grew up, we got jobs, we made our money, and we live. We need to give there. We also need to look at people where, the place we came from, our parents came from, and so forth. And so that's giving to India, where the dollar can go much longer. So our campaigns are really created and focused on give where you live or you give to India. And we encourage everyone to say do both. But if you can only give to one place, you pick. There's no one good or bad way. But one of the things we want to do for the next generation of people is to really also expose them to where their heritage was and where their parents and ancestors came from, just so that there's a feeling of connection and so forth. So that's why we do both. But there's no good or right or wrong answer to this one.
What's the main, perhaps, especially for folks in my generation who are born and brought up here, who comprise a big portion of the diaspora and who struggle sometimes with not just the identity part, but with the notion of what do I embrace? And, it also evolves over time, right? You make these discoveries about linkages back to your own culture, and at times you might be uninterested in that as well. How have you seen this evolve either personally or in the history of INDIASPORA? Thinking a little bit about that, particularly because this is not a unique situation to the US. It certainly plays out in the UK. It certainly plays out in other places abroad.
we are very cognizant of the next generation. And so one of the things we've been looking at, the Jewish community has been very helpful to us in terms of telling us what to do and best practices and so forth. One of the things they did, and we've tried now to emulate that, is they have a program called Birthright Israel, where any child of Jewish heritage, when they turn 18, they can apply for a program where they spend a month in Israel on a kibbutz, learning about history of Israel, traveling the country, talking to people. They immerse themselves a month at no charge, at no cost to them. So a couple of years ago, we tried a similar experiment within Diaspora called Heritage India, where we selected from the US a dozen or so kids of Indian origin. And we took them to India for 3 weeks, to New Delhi for a week to learn about the history and culture. They then went to Gandhi's ashram in Ahmedabad for a week to do a service. And they went to South India to experience what was going on there. Yeah. Very, very successful. We're now trying to make this more of a consistent program, if you will. Yeah. That was one element. The second thing is through our Indian office, which we're just opening, we want to be a conduit for, let's say, your kids and mine when they are growing up and they say, you know what, we want to do a summer internship in India. We don't know anything about it. We want to be able to help them find jobs in India for summer internships. But some people are now coming to us and saying, you know what, I've graduated. I don't want to join Goldman Sachs. I really want to do something more different and meaningful. And they want to go to India. We may even be able to place them for full-time jobs in India. Yeah. And so what we want to do for the next gen is really open up this thing where India becomes just like going to California or New York. It's an extension of that. And that way they get opened up to a different culture. That's one way I think we can, with the next generation, really connect them to the homeland.
You know, we're almost at the spring of 2022. And as you now both reflect on the past, but also look forward, what's the number one challenge right now that you're working on? And perhaps what are you most optimistic about?
Yeah, I think the number one challenge is really the geopolitics that are happening now, where it's almost like countries have to choose sides on everything. Yeah. So it's almost like you're with us or against us kind of mode that the world has turned into. Both politics in the US has become that way. You're either on the Republican side or the Democratic side. And now in geopolitical situations, same thing. You're on one side or the other side. There's no more neutrality, no more nuanced relationships. It's almost picking sides. I think that's a huge challenge for a country like India to navigate through, as India is going through now. It's almost, in the world situation today, that's what India is stuck with, is like, you're with us or you're on the other side. And it's like...
And do you find that the movement or the membership of the Indian diaspora sort of is susceptible to this kind of tribalism too?
Absolutely. I think, with the politics going that way, I think there's always the two extremes get more vocal. Yes. So I think we're definitely susceptible to that. I think so far it's been kept under wraps, but I wouldn't be surprised if it comes out more in the open. That's, I think, the biggest concern today with media, with misinformation and disinformation and WhatsApp messages going around without ever having any fact checks. I mean, that is really causing huge problems even within the diaspora and within India itself. And so I think is the biggest challenge we face. But on the other hand, I'm hopeful that humanity, we all have good qualities that, kind of supersede any of these negativity and bad things that are happening around us, to say, at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We're here to help each other. We're here to evolve into even better human beings. So I hope, good sense will prevail as we move forward, as opposed to, this parochial politics or fighting and polarization. I'm very hopeful, because I think we can always get pessimistic thinking of all the negative things going on. But in the past 100 years, I think the world has actually been a good place, a better place than it was. But, we don't read stories that say things are better. We always tend to click on a story that says something bad happened, and so we need to get out of that mentality.
Well, so many good things are happening because of you. Your sense of humanity and your kindness is inspiring. MR, thank you so much for joining us for this chat, and I hope you'll come back and join us again.
Thank you for having me, Abhay.
Thanks so much, MR. And please go to INDIASPORA.org to check out much more. And a hearty congratulations to all the medical students who matched into residency last week. Till next time, I'm Abhay Darndekar.
Ruckus Avenue Radio.